Wheels Through Time, there are hundreds of motorcycles and dozens of cars, each with a story all of their own. From the rarest antiques to the most iconic styles, we are dedicated to telling the story of these old bikes.
Well, I told a friend of mine in Utah I would make a tutorial video on how to start, run, and operate a pre-war Harley-Davidson WL. So what I thought I would do, being a school teacher, is consult the book. And I found this book, Training the Military Motorcyclist, and of course that's on a WLA, so this book ought to fit. And so I got to page 1, and let me read you what it says, and I hope this doesn't trouble my friend. The practice motorcycle. It is advisable to use an older motorcycle for preliminary riding instructions. The headlight may be removed to prevent damaging it. On such motorcycle, mars and dents occurring from minor mishaps will not cause embarrassment to an unfortunate student. The throttles on the preliminary training motorcycles should be set on control wire to limit the speed to 25. So much for that book. I'm going to teach you how to run, ride, and operate this bike without the book. But first thing I want to do is give you a little history lesson on the WL Harley-Davidson prior to World War II. In 1937, Harley-Davidson developed the WL model, and this was a big improvement over the RL model, and let me tell you why. It had an engine very much like the 36 Knucklehead and the new UL model made also in 1937, but the WL motor now recirculates oil. You didn't just put oil in the tank and it burned it. It actually circulates oil through the engine back up to the oil tank. It's called the dry sump system. Now, there's lots of other improvements on the WL pre-war. The post-war, we'll save that for later. But the reason I chose this motorcycle, it's a WL all right, but it's a very special WL. It's a WLDR. And the WLDR was the sport and competition model, and this one truly is a sport and competition WLDR. There was only about 150 of the WLDR made. The standard WL series, I think they made about 600 in 1938. So it's really interesting. In 1938, Benny Campanella won Daytona on a WLDR. His best friend from Woonsocket, Rhode Island, Babe Tancred, won Daytona in 39 and 1940, and that's kind of the end of the Daytona story with the WLDR. But this machine, built in low production, was built for racing only. It was a road model in racing form, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. You know, I've studied the Harley 45, I think, since I was 16 years old, and behind me is the entire fleet, and I think there's over 60 Harley 45s here, all special and all different. But let me tell you a little bit more about this 1938 WLDR, and what makes it incredibly special is the heart of the engine right here. And this 1938 WLDR certainly is special. It has features on it that no other 1938 WLDR has that I have ever seen. And let me kind of start on the top, the heart of the engine. This particular engine has aluminum heads. This particular type of aluminum head was really cast as iron heads, so somehow in the racing department, I guess simply put, they put aluminum in the cast iron mold. I've only ever seen 3 sets of these heads. Moving down, the cylinders, 1938, they don't have as many fins as the racing bikes in 39, and that's standard. But what isn't standard is right here. This particular set of cylinders has 1.9/16" intake manifold nuts. That's the same as a big twin knucklehead, a WR. It also has the bronze intake manifold and a 4-bolt carburetor. Now, I've only seen this combination on a few bikes. One of those bikes happens to be my first Harley 45, my 3-wheel chopper, small fins, as the guys say, small fins, big port, makes this bike run really good. But let me tell you a little bit more about the WL model. This was the engine I mentioned had the recirculating oil system. If you look at this engine, it looks entirely different than the DL or the RL model. They had a throttle-controlled oil pump, a timer down here. This one is much more modern. As I mentioned, the WL came out in 1937. By 1938, they had made some nice improvements, including the transmission transmission. I'll tell you more about that. But the engine itself is such a simple engine, but they work so well. Some of the components on the engine, obviously spark plugs on top. That's your intake manifold. These are your valve covers. Underneath that are the valve springs and the valve stems. It's a side valve motor, so the valves are going up and down. This is your ignition distributor. Now this is so important. You always start the bike on the retard position. That's where that knob is right there. Now the left hand grip, that's advance. Turn the left hand grip toward you, it advances the spark. Advance is where you run down the road. Retard's where you start the bike or when you idle the bike and you want to look really cool. Now up front is the generator. The little magic box right here, that's the relay. It's not a voltage regulator. That generator is called a 32E. They came out in 1932, ran all the way to 1957. Probably the best generator Harley ever built, and don't take anybody else's word for it but me. Oil pump right here. This is the pump that returns the oil, feeds the oil through the engine. On the very bottom is the return pump. The third line is a vent. Very simple. Moving backwards, behind the engine's the battery box. This is the negative wire or the ground wire. On the other side of the battery is the ignition coil. We're going to go over the left side of the bike in just a couple of minutes. Kickstarter right here, obviously very simple. All Harley 45s have the rear chain on the right. Very simple. Another thing that's very important on the 750 Harley is keeping the chain in adjustment. The adjusters right here, it's the simplest thing. And the one thing that I really want to share with people that buy a restored machine or ride a restored machine, when this bike was built new in 1938, the checklist of things that you do at 500 miles was that long. And I can assure you, I can't build a bike any better than they did at Harley Davidson in 1938. So when you get 300, 400, 500 miles, better start working on the checklist. The checklist isn't hard to find. It's in the book. I think the left side of a Harley 45 is one of the only Harleys looks really as cool as the right side. Plenty of activity going on. Going to start with the front brake, and it works so perfect. Front brake lever. By the way, this brake lever, 1928 to 1940 only. It's really a cool thing. Cast iron. Look at that front brake activity. Works great. This cable's all trimmed out properly all the way down to the grease fitting on the bottom. So front brake here. Horn, of course, doesn't work on this bike because it's a race bike and there is no horn. On a WL road model, the horn would be sitting right up here. No horn on a WLDR. 3-speed transmission. The Harley transmission, a 3-speed transmission for a 45 changed probably 5 times. 1938 was probably the first year of a better transmission. They totally upgraded that in 41. So a 1938, 39, 40 transmission, they're heavy duty, but handle them with caution. I'll tell you a little more about that right down here to the clutch. And this is the most important instrument on this motorcycle. The most important control is the clutch, and it works like that. When the clutch is heeled down, the engine is disconnected from the rear wheel. So the engine could be running in gear and you could just be sitting right there, not going anywhere. When you toe this clutch down, that's when you take off and go. Now everybody has heard the word suicide clutch. That's when you take off this spring and this clutch becomes like a car clutch. Push it in, comes back by itself. So the real significance of a rocker clutch, it's a safety clutch. This is the safest clutch in the world. The most important aspect of this clutch, it's not, it's called a toe or heel clutch, but it's really an articulation of the ankle. It's so important. I'll show you how you do that in just a minute. So you got your brake, you got your clutch, you got your 3-speed transmission right here. This is the carburetor. The most important thing you need to understand about this carburetor is the choke. Up is on, down is where you run. Up is on, down is where you run. Now 45s are naturally cold in nature, and even if the bike is sitting for just a few minutes, you probably ought to kick it with the choke on, without the key on at least once. Take the choke to half, turn your key on, the bike will start right up. We're going to do a cold start in just a minute. Moving back, you have your ignition coil. That's got your plug wires. It's what makes it spark. Probably the other thing that's so important, and you can't see it, that's the primary chain. It's located in the housing on the left side, different than the rear chain. Primary chains also need adjustment. Follow your booklet. There's 2 bolts and an adjuster. Don't let this chain get out of adjusted. But when you adjust this chain, you have to adjust that chain because everything's connected. Let me show you how to start this thing. I don't think there's any more fun bike to ride than a Harley 45. That's why I have so many. But I want to tell you a couple more things, actually 4 more things about this bike before I start it up and take off out of here. First thing, steering dampener. So when you're going down the road, if you want a little bit straighter ride, this is the dampener right here. Loosen it, tighten it. Up here, very much like the RL, this is the ride control. It controls the fork dampening. That's your ride going down the road. And the other thing I didn't tell you, the left cap is the gas cap and the right cap is the oil cap. And the way you know that is in the right oil cap is a dipstick so you can check your oil. That's how it goes on a Harley WL. All WLs have gas on the left, oil on the right. So now let me tell you how to start this motorcycle. This engine is cold right now, so I'm going to start it just like you would start a cold engine. The first thing you do is come down to the front. Make sure your gasoline is on. Secondly, as I told you earlier, lift the choke lever up. Over here on the spark, you want to retard the spark. That's going away from you. Advance is going toward you. On the throttle, you want to give it 0 throttle, back it off. Then it's a matter of relaxing. You don't have to kick a Harley really hard. You just have to push the pedal through firmly. So I'm going to give this thing 2 kicks, choke on, key off, throttle off, 2, 1 for good measure. I'm going to take the choke off to halfway. I'm going to turn the key on for the very first time, and this bike will start on 1 kick. Every time. Now you don't want to run off with a cold engine. Let that thing warm up for 30 seconds. 19, 18, 17, 16, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and away we go. Through wheels, through time.